Thank you. Thank you for having us today. We're super excited to be here at the Games for Change Festival to share just a bit of our expertise building VR experiences, really with the purpose of generating positive change. My name is Dali, and I lead the UX research team at Jigsaw, which is a group within Google that aims to use technology to try to keep people in the world safe. I've been tinkering with
I'm
VR
Ayush.
for the past 4 years. Sorry, go ahead.
And I'm Ayush. I am an extended reality user experience researcher at Keylime Interactive. Keylime is a UX research and design agency that has been working with Google on several projects in the last few years.
Thank you. And we're ready for our slides. Yes. Thank you. If you don't mind going to the third one. One more. Thank you so much. So in our work, a challenge that we're often faced with is how to evaluate if what we are designing is actually generating this change that we set out to create. How do we know if what we want to measure, how do we measure it, and then what do we do with the results? We wanted to share a framework to define and measure change in VR. Ayush and I really think that if you follow the steps, you'll have the information that you and your team need to move forward with confidence. We'll walk you through a bit of theory, but a lot of practical tips on how to define your objective, define how to measure change, with whom you should evaluate it, only a bit of analyzing best practices, and then how to make sense of it all. So the first step in any challenge, really, but in particular for us here, it's to have an agreed goal. And a way of thinking about that in this space is called theory of change. It's a comprehensive description of why a desired change is expected to happen in a particular context. With this specific type of methodology, you can use it for planning, for participation and evaluation, and it's really used extensively to promote social change. It helps to define a long-term goal and then map it backwards to identify all the necessary preconditions. It's very tempting to start any project by focusing on the what and on the how. It's, after all, how we usually explain something. What do we want to achieve and how we're planning to get there? But the first step and the most difficult one of defining a goal for change should actually be to start really thinking about debating with everyone you can and finally agreeing upon the why. Why are you going to invest your time and all your resources in this amazing project? Why is it so important to you, to your team, and to the world? Simon Sinek calls this the golden circle. And he has a lot of amazing examples, and I highly recommend that you watch his TED Talk if you haven't. And in his talk, he describes how if we focus on the why, everything else falls into place. So after you and your team have agreed upon the why, the process of theory of change continues with asking more questions. What is your long-term goal? And once your goal has been identified, what conditions must be in place for us to reach it? Finally, what other paths have you taken or have been taken already that might lead to the same change? In the past, there's been a lot of research around changing people's behaviors and perspectives through VR. Reducing biases, for example, as you can see an example here, building empathy, or another example from Stanford of caring about the environment. In our team, we have been exploring for a while the possible role of VR with high-stake professions that could lead to a lot of stress, in particular during those moments when we have to make really difficult decisions. An example is first responders. Through observing and doing research in VR for a little bit, it was clear that people had a very strong emotional response to VR, and that was even in very low fidelity scenarios. If anyone has tried the Richie Planks experience, you might know what I'm talking about. You go up in an elevator, it looks like a cartoon, but most people get really nervous before jumping off. We also became aware that mindfulness is a very robust technique to manage and reduce stress. clear your mind, and to make better decisions. But a common barrier for people to practice mindfulness is that it requires a lot of time and expertise, and you need that in order to be able to learn it. We decided that we wanted to explore if mindfulness through VR could reduce stress in those professions, how feasible it would be to create something that would appeal to them, and finally incorporate it into the regular training. To define our theory of change, we started with the why. The reason we thought this work was important and could potentially lead to impact was that stress is really a big concern for a lot of people, but including first respondents and others in high risk professions. They need to be alert and they need to make decisions in split seconds. We follow with the what, and we had this insight that I mentioned about mindfulness being a known method to combat stress. The training is long and tedious. Finally, we knew that VR could be a powerful and inexpensive method to teach people mindfulness. So, our long term goal was to make mindfulness in VR ubiquitous as a tool to reduce stress.
So once you figure out the why, how, and the what, you need to know what metrics to measure and how to measure them. Next slide. So there are several different metrics that you can measure, and there are various different ways to measure each one of them. So when it comes to change, you can always look at behavioral data. So you can look at attention and engagement. You look at how people use it, how people perform using an app. So for example, if you're looking at a mindfulness app, you can look at how much attention people are paying to their breath or just the environment outside. You can also look at physiological measures like heart rate, skin conductance level, and EEG. So for a mindfulness app, you expect the heart rate to go down as people feel more relaxed, so you can measure that. You can also look at simulation data, just how much time people spend in the app itself, how much they move around, they move their head, their body. So for example, mindfulness, again, you expect them to not move their head around because they're focusing on their breath and not the environment itself. And when it comes to VR specifically, you should always think about measuring presence, agency, and embodiment. These are some things that help you understand what's going on in the effect, and they also tell you if people are engaged in the activity itself, or if they're not, engaged in the environment at all, if they're distracted by something else. Next slide. So once you know the metrics, it's pretty straightforward to measure VR in the lab or your workspace. You just set something up, you have participants come in, and you can easily understand, what's going on. You can give them feedback, you can receive feedback, you can look at their body language and reactions to visual stimuli and understand what's going on. But what happens when you want to look at change over time? Because change is something difficult that you can't just look at in one session. And what happens when you can't test in person, like for due to a pandemic like we have right now? Next slide. In that case, a VR diary study is an excellent opportunity. So for our study with first responders, we wanted to look at their practices of mindfulness. So although it made it difficult because now all our participants were in an uncontrolled environment, but it also made it highly ecologically valid because this is how eventually they will be using it. So we did a 12-day diary study where we had them measure their stress level, their mindfulness awareness using a survey, time spent using the app, and obviously presence in VR. And some of these were sort of on an interval, like every 3 days or so. Some of these were measured every day, like presence and time spent. Next slide. So once you know the metrics, you need to know what kind of people to recruit for your particular study and how many. Next slide. So how many participants is a very common question to and the answer is usually not as simple. So it depends on the metrics you're measuring and if you're running a qualitative study or a quantitative study. If you're qualitative, you can probably get away with smaller number of samples because they give you a lot more data, a lot more behavior to observe. But with quantitative data, you can have a lot more. You need more participants to have a good trend. But irrespective of what you choose, you kind of have to be aware of the assumptions, the limitations, the risks of your decisions. Next slide. So when it comes to selecting the right participants, always care about quality, not quantity. You need quality data to have meaningful insights. And we are still fairly new, and you can have unforeseen consequences depending on the visual stimuli that you see. So always ask participants about their pre-existing conditions. ever have experienced VR or they actually get sick in VR. And be mindful of the data that you gather from them. Always store it in a secure location without personal identifiable information. And when recruiting, always recruit a diverse set of participants. If you get an overarching trend from the data set that you have, that's excellent. If not, that tells you that there's bias in your design and you need to do a good job of inclusively designing for your application. And diversity, not just in terms of gender and race, but also in terms of experiencing or experience related to the domain of your VR application. You can have people come in who have a lot of experience in the domain of your application, and they will exhibit a very different behavior as compared to people who have no experience with VR or the domain of your application. And always test for accessibility. VR gives people who are differently able an opportunity to experience things in VR that they might not be able to in the real world. So you should always have participants who can experience all of these things equally well in VR. So you should test for color blindness, low vision, low perception of stereo acuity, low depth perception, stigmatism, etc. Next slide. So you might be wondering, all this sounds like a lot of work, so why should you actually pay attention? Well, first of all, it makes your team aware of all the existing biases within the development and design process. And you can also apply all these findings related to bias and change related to all these things in other products that you build. And it also makes your user feel cherished and valued. And if they feel cherished and valued, you know they will be coming back to use your application and you will reach a much wider audience, which eventually is going to result in a bigger impact and a bigger result in change, and also will get you more business. Next slide.
So to summarize that, Ayush, I would say don't test with your friends only. Anyway, because now you've collected all your data and you're ready to analyze all the results. You know exactly who you should test with, and you run all your participants. And on the next slide, this is a really interesting graph that I like showing when I teach analysis methods. And I always say that going from insights to wisdom, sorry, going from data to insights or wisdom, it's really a messy and hard to replicate process. I like to describe it as more of an art form than a science, although, of course, there are very robust analytical methods. People train with PhDs like Ayush here to understand how to run those analyses. But it will really be dependent on your project and your research. And a place I will say where most of us will start is to do some quick tests and some quick exploratory analysis, in particular when the insights are needed to inform development or a project that we're working on, and it's not really to publish a scientific journal. If you have someone on your team, or if you have the ability to consult with someone with a data science expertise, I think that will be key in helping you make this process more robust. For our mindfulness app, we analyzed all the self-reported stress data, and we found that it was reduced almost by half, which was really amazing. But unfortunately, we were not able to find an increase in mindfulness. So we had to assume there was something else going on, something else was going at play here. We analyzed the qualitative feedback, and this was a little bit more revealing. There was something on the positive side, you can see that there was something about the fact that people took the time from their busy schedule to do the exercise, and that seemed to influence the lower levels of stress going on. The negative side, we learned also a lot from that, and we found that some things that we're not expecting. So, for example, the usability of the hardware and the length of the exercise, it bothers some participants. And it was also interesting to learn that the feeling of relaxing or not being stressed, which is what we were wanting to promote, could be seen negatively as well. So, like for example, if someone wanted to be energized and active, they describe the feeling as being sleepy rather than feeling calm. So, what does it all mean? Sometimes, all these insights lead to something very tangible, and you know exactly what to do. And everything you learn through the process is very actionable, either by you or your team. But sometimes what it means, it's really not as clear. And that was the case with our mindfulness app. Our next slide, we're showing a little bit what we did. And basically what we tried to do is to bring the team together. On the next slide, please. Yeah, here you can see some images of us. We did what at Google we call a design sprint. I think many people are now running design sprints. And it's a way of ideating. And we wanted to present the research findings to the team and ask them to think through exercises what the research findings meant to them. So rather than us having to tell them, they came up with their own answers. And this was a way for us to also go back to the drawing board to come up with new ideas, because obviously the one that we initiated with was not 100% working as we intended to.
So to finish all of this off with, we wanted to leave you with some tips on the user experience of testing itself. So number one, expect the unexpected. When you're recruiting participants, there are going to be a lot of people who have long hair and they put them in different hairstyles and buns. And a lot of people also wear glasses. So when they come in, they will need a lot of time to adjust their hair or adjust their glasses. They have on a display. So make sure you're planning for that. You have a little bit of time accounted for that. And there are also a lot of people who get really sick from VR, or they don't have, very high vision, but they can still use VR. So for them, it is really important that you actually measure the distance between their eyes and actually adjust that on the head and mounted display if it's available. That's usually done by adjusting the distance between the lenses, and just make sure that you do that so they are more comfortable with your experience. And a lot of people don't actually have experience with VR or your application for that matter. So give them some time to actually acclimate to the environment itself. Have them do some activities like walking around, exploring, reaching for things. Unless obviously the task of the simulation itself is to see if people can get and pick up on those things. And also give them some time to get used to the equipment itself. A lot of people will not know what the knuckles controllers are, and they would need to know, how to hold them, what buttons to press, etc. So just make sure that they actually pick those up and get a feel for it before they actually jump into the VR simulation. Number two, budget extra time. Especially in the industry, timelines are very short. You need to have a very quick project turnaround. And that's not always your friend when you need to collect good data, especially when it comes to bias. So always have a diverse set of participants. And if you don't get an overarching trend, that's a signal enough to anybody who's higher up than you to say, okay, we actually need more participants and to give you more time. And when it comes to recruiting people, especially people like first responders, it is extremely hard because they have very busy schedules, and obviously they have much more pressing matters on their hands. So it is better to start recruiting early, and if you can, work with a partner who already has access to people like that, so they can actually help you get through your study. Number four, pink eye is a real thing. There is a lot of concern with hygiene in VR. So make sure that you're wiping down the equipment between every participant. You don't know if people have some infections or not. They sweat on the head-mounted display, and they might also have makeup or something else on their face that might get on the headset. So just make sure to clean that, and also if you can, use disposable face masks. That's the best. Next slide. And with
Oh,
that, thank you so much for attending this session.